Let's make this green corset together. I found this jacket from the op shop, which has a really lovely pale green colour with flowers and vines all through it, and I immediately fell in love with it when I saw it. I knew I wanted to turn it into something, and I just made sure that it had enough fabric that I would be able to make something new with it. So when I open it up like this, you can see that there's quite a bit of fabric here to work with. The pattern I'm using is from Nikita Cosplay, and it's the self-made princess pattern, and I did adjust this pattern a bit so it's shorter waisted. For the lining fabric, I'm using a leftover fabric from one of my previous projects. This is actually the fabric that I used for my Snow White cosplay, and it's an upholstery fabric, so it's quite heavyweight and heavy duty, and I think this will provide the perfect amount of structure required for this bodice. I fold the fabric in half and I place the pattern like so, and you can see that I've cut some parts of the pattern so I can move those out of the way to cut the pattern that I want without having to permanently alter those pattern pieces. So I proceed to cut out all of these pattern pieces. The pattern includes seam allowance, so I just cut right up to the edge of the paper. I do this for all of the pattern pieces, and that gives me 2 layers of fabric per pattern piece. Now, to make more space on the jacket fabric, I cut open the bottom hem of the jacket to give me a bit more of that space to work with so I can lay out my pattern pieces onto the jacket. I just made sure that there was enough space for each of my pattern pieces, and then I went on to cutting out the jacket pieces along the jacket seams. This makes sure that the pattern lays nice and flat and I can easily cut out my pattern pieces. I repeat this on the other side of the jacket and cut out, like I said, along the seams of the jacket so I can lay those pieces flat and cut out my pattern pieces. I cut out 2 layers of fabric from this fashion layer, and I use the lining pieces as a guide. It just means that I don't have to deal with the paper patterns since they're not my favorite to cut around. Here you can see all of my pieces cut out. I have 2 of each for the fashion fabric and 2 of each for the lining fabric. I like to lay them against one another so I know that I've got all the pieces that I need. One thing to mention is that I did cut the center front so it was smaller than what I would need because I wanted it to lace up at the front. So constructing this corset, I use what I call the sandwich method. But before we get into that, I will show you how I did the center front. So I grabbed my 2 layers of fabric, 1 fashion and 1 lining, and I stitched them right sides together along the center front. So when this is opened up, it is a little bit puffy, and I want this to lay nice and smooth and flat. So what I will do to combat this is a little bit of understitching on the lining side, and I make sure to catch the seam allowance under that. And that is all of the seam allowance, so both layers of the fabric. And that then helps the lining fabric lay nice and flat and flush against the fashion fabric when they're turned right sides out. I then proceed to sewing in a boning channel along the center front, and I also sew a little bit away from that boning channel because this will be the area for the eyelets. And then 1 more channel is sewn beside that, and this will form the second boning channel. So there's 2 boning channels either side of where the eyelets are going to be positioned along the center front of the bodice. Remember, this is just one side of the bodice front. I do also need to repeat this for the other side, but we will get to that once I complete this side of the bodice. So we're starting on pieces number 2, and this one has a little gentle curve in it because it goes over the bust. So this is what I call the sandwich method. I'm sandwiching the pieces that I just sewed in between the 2 new pieces that I need to add to it. It's a little bit difficult to explain, so I'm hoping that what I'm showing on screen right now is able to visually guide you. I will explain it again and again every time I add pieces, so hopefully you will get used to the idea of this concept. So I sandwich the center front piece in between the 2 side front pieces, and I make sure that the side front pieces are right sides touching, but with the center piece sandwiched in the middle. I then sew along that curve, making sure that everything is aligned as best as I can. So it's a little bit thick, so we need to trim down the seam allowance. That will help when we turn those pieces right side out. And I also do a little bit of clipping along the curved edge because that will also help reduce the bulk in that area. So now we get to turn those pieces right side out. And what this means is pulling out the lining and pulling out the fashion fabric so they lay flush against one another, right sides out. Again, you can see that area in the middle along that seam is quite puffy, so I am making that nice and flat with top stitching, which also serves as a boning channel. Moving on to the next piece, this is piece number 3. I position the fashion fabric right sides together on the fashion side and the lining piece right sides together on the lining side. I sandwich the whole thing in between those new layers and sew that down. Trim the seam allowance, and this one's a straight edge so I don't clip any of the edges, and I just effectively pull out the lining and the fashion layer and then do a top stitch, which serves as my boning channel. This helps to keep it nice and smooth, and it's also important to make sure that the boning channel that's sewn is large enough to fit the boning. Moving on to the 4th panel now. Same thing again, sandwich those pieces in between the new layers, right sides together, and then stitch it all down. Again, trim the seam allowance and then pull out those layers so they're facing right sides out and sitting flush against one another before sewing down the boning channel along that seam. The final pieces now, this is the back piece with a strap. So same thing again, sandwiching those pieces together and then sewing it all the way down, trimming the seam allowance, pulling those pieces out, and then sewing in the boning channel / top stitching. I also sew the straps of the fashion layer together, right sides together, as well as the lining straps, right sides together of the lining. I then finger press those pieces outwards of the seam allowance of the straps and position them together, and then do a stitch in the ditch across the top. A stitch in the ditch is basically sewing in the actual seam that's already there. And this is what it looks like on. I've just got half of the bodice done up until the center back. I then need to repeat that whole process for the other side. I won't show you that, so we'll just skip to what this whole thing looks like laid out flat on the table. There is the inside. Some of those seams are a bit lumpy, but I don't really mind. Once I've done up the other side, I need to attach them together at the center back seam, which you can see here from the lining side. I've already stitched the center back seam right sides together. I just need to stitch the lining, which I couldn't figure out any other better way to do this. So I have just placed the lining over the top of each other and turned under the raw edge, and I'm just top stitching across all of that. And this is what it looks like from the outside. I did do 3 lines of stitching to make sure that that was all secure and looks somewhat decent. And here it is from the inside as well. And this is where we're at. We've got a good structure. The weight of the lining really helps in keeping the structure of the bodice, which I'm very pleased about. And this is what the back looks like. It still needs a modesty panel, so I used one of the sleeves from the jacket as the fabric for the modesty panel. I turned the sleeve inside out and I sewed the modesty panel right sides together before trimming the seam allowance and clipping the corners and turning it right side out. I top stitched all around the edges of that modesty panel, and that's basically all I did for that. The top stitching provides nice structure, and I really like how this modesty panel turned out. Now I trim off the bottom edges of the corset to make sure that that's all even, and I do a little bit of a try on with the modesty panel to see how that's all looking. I'm very happy with the shape, but there is a little bit of restrictive movement from the underarm seams, so I need to cut those a bit deeper. I'm going to bind off all of the edges of this corset, and for this I used bias binding in a white cotton. So to do this, I open up the bias binding and place it along the lining side of the bodice. I sew all of that down, and then once that's sewn down, I trim the seam allowance, and then I can flip over the bias binding to the right side and then top stitch that down. I try and stitch as closely as possible to the edge of the bias binding. And this really nicely seals off all of my edges. All of those raw, ugly edges are gone, and this is how it looks. I haven't done the top edges yet because I still need to insert some boning, but I did, however, just shape that top bit, so I liked it a bit more. For boning, I'm using cable ties. I snip off any of the cable tie that I don't want and trim it down to size. I also round off the edges of the cable ties so they don't poke through the fabric and are not sharp. I cut 2 cable ties for each front piece, and I insert those in, as you can see on the screen now, and I leave a bit of a gap at the top edge so I can still add the bias binding and trim off this excess seam allowance. So I only did cable ties in the front pieces because that's where it needed it, because that's where the eyelets are going to go, but I didn't feel like it needed anywhere else. So I did do all of those other boning channels, but I didn't end up using them. Now that the boning is in, I can seal off the top edge, again with that white bias binding. I sew it to the lining side of the corset, and I sew in that fold of the bias binding, and then I trim the seam allowance and then flip the bias binding to the right side and top stitch all of that down. I do this for both the top edge of the corset as well as the armholes after I've adjusted the armholes to my liking. So you can see that that's pretty much done, and we just have a few more steps before we're finished. I'm going to add in the Modesty panel so you can see how that looks, and it's also good just to make sure that it measures up nicely. I'm pretty happy with that, but I do feel like the Modesty panel needs to be stitched in place, which I did do here. I only stitched it in at that top part because I did want to be able to adjust the Modesty panel. So you can see the Modesty panel there. It's attached, but not too attached to the point where I can't maneuver it while it's on the body. So the last step is to add eyelets. I marked 1.5 inches apart where the eyelets were going to go in that space between those 2 boning channels. I pierce the fabric with my awl and make the hole big enough for the eyelets to fit through. I first put in the eyelet that has a protruding center part, and that goes through from the outside of the fabric. Once that's positioned in place, I then put the washer that goes on top on the back. I put this underneath my eyelet tool machine and I press down really hard to secure that eyelet in place. And that's what it looks like. I'm very happy with how these eyelets turned out. I just need to do the other side, and once that's done, we are pretty much finished with the corset. We just need to add some lacing, and that is it. I used some green ribbon to crisscross that through, and it ends in a bow at the bottom. I'm going to show you how I style it. I have this white dress as a base, and then I put on my green skirt that I made, and I tie that on, and I love this skirt because it also has a pocket. And then the bodice goes on top with the green ribbon for the lacing. I tie that in a bow at the bottom, and I needed to trim off the ends, so I did that. And I really like how this is looking, but we can be a bit more extra. So why not add a few belts? All of these are from the op shop, and I love them for all of my cosplays. And the one that's my favorite is this one here. It has this beautiful texture. So I'll include that, but I'll also include this belt so I can attach my little leather pouch. I love this bag, it's so cute. I hike up the skirt, and that is pretty much the outfit done. I didn't put on my brown boots for this, but I would wear this outfit with my brown boots. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked this video, please leave me a comment. Where would you wear a bodice like this? And will you be making something? Did this tutorial help you? I hope it did. I have a bunch of other sewing tutorials on my channel. I've got a heap of playlists, and I do a lot of costume and cosplay things in the fantasy realm. So if you're interested in any of that, please do check those videos out. Until next time, stay creative.